Hello, everyone, and welcome to my live stream. It's Charlene Lee here, and I am thrilled, absolutely thrilled to welcome my friend and neighbor, Gary Bolles, to the live. Welcome, Gary.
Charlie, I welcome any chance for us to talk, but this is an especially great opportunity.
Yeah, and we're here today to celebrate and to talk about Gary's brand new book, The Next Rules of Work. Today is your launch day, Gary.
Yes, which I just dropped off in your vestibule yesterday, so on my bike ride.
Congratulations, a huge accomplishment. We have been talking about this book, I feel, for a very long time, and I am so excited to be talking about it today. We're capping off a month of talking about culture and work and what that future looks like. And I can't think of a better way to talk about this than to talk about the next rules of work with Gary, who has been studying the future of work for a very long time. So as we get started, I do want to encourage people to come in and share where you're coming from. But also, please share that if you had a magic wand, what would you want to change about work? What drives you nuts? What do you think just is such a no-brainer that we should just absolutely not have it happening anymore? And share what you would change about work. And we'll see what Gary has laid out in terms of what he thinks, and we'll see what the intersections are. And again, it's a great opportunity for you to ask any questions of Gary. Just put in the chat and we'll have chances to talk about that.
Wonderful.
So, Gary, your title, The Next Rules of Work, has this basic assumption built into it that there's something wrong with the rules of work today. So what's wrong with work? I'm sure you have a whole long list, but what are some of the key highlights from that?
So absolutely. I mean, there's throughout history, and I have a brief history of the future of work, sort of through the ages in the book. But throughout history, there's no question we've changed the rules of work. And some people don't want to say that they're rules; they want to say they're guidelines or practices, and that's fine too. But basically, there's these unwritten rules that we have followed. That work is in an office and often is 9 to 5, or that, those are sort of the basic ones. But then there's a whole bunch of rules that change, whether they're good or bad, whether we like them or not. And there's a number of changes that I suggest should happen. And so talking in the book about these old rules of work, which many people still practice. If you think about industrial era processes like long commutes and having to all be in the same office, well, then along came a virus and that sort of changed some of those practices. But they're always changing. And if we had this conversation just before the pandemic, we would have said, oh, it's robots and software, like done. And then a virus changed the way we think about what the rules are about whether we need to all be in the same place and how we communicate with each other. And so the rules that should always change is we should be thinking about how to make it more human-centric. And instead, what happens is that we sort of adjust driven by a couple of different influences, what the technology allows us or encourages us to do, the ways management practices in different countries around the world continually change. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's reactive as opposed to proactive. And so that's really what happened with the pandemic. We all reacted to the virus, we sheltered in place, and then we had to come up with a whole bunch of the next rules. And so the example that I use is if we think of the kind of disruption, which you write about frequently, that can be these black swan events, these things we hadn't anticipated, then we will always, if all we're going to do is just react, then we're not in charge. But if instead we anticipate the next rules and we co-create them together, we're going to have a much better future of work.
So if we had been proactive about just even things like where people work from, then it would have been a lot easier. In fact, that's what we saw when the pandemic came along. People who were already putting in these next rules of work and practicing them were much better prepared for the pandemic when it came along.
There's a company that is actually a client of mine, Pax8, and they're basically a cloud platform for cloud providers, and which I guess is a little redundant. But they said that they were able to shift to distributed work As my friend John O'Doin, with his book Distributed Work calls it, it's much more distributed. We're not remote, but we're distributed. They shifted to distributed work in 36 hours. And so companies that already were reasonably digital and thought of themselves as having a whole bunch of these more nimble practices almost shrugged off the response. It doesn't mean that it was easy or that it's the right way to be able to continue to work, but they certainly were able to adapt to that kind of disruption much more rapidly.
So it's interesting, I'll just give another example that came in the comments here from Jay Bryant. He's in Rockford. Hello, Jay. Thanks for joining us. And he said for his magic wand, if he had one, he would blow up the review process. I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts about just what are the rules around that are broken. What's wrong with it, and how would you want to change?
Absolutely. So Jay, I think that's an excellent point. So again, we seem to not always question the rationale for so many of these practices that actually have their roots in industrial and post-industrial world. And if you think about it, the production mindset that we're producing something on a conveyor belt actually has sort of transferred itself into an awful lot of work. There's a sequence of things, and then our performance, which is not one of my favorite words, I prefer effectiveness. Our performance is rated, and it's rated by somebody in the role of a manager, which is also not one of my favorite words. And I don't want to make myself the word police, but I think we need a new mindset for a lot of these roles. And so the review process is basically a hangover from that production period, which said that, okay, for a year, or a quarter, or whatever the period is, I'm going to assess your performance, which is going to be very metrics based. And I'm going to compare what I hoped your performance to be to what it was. And you're going to get a review. And it's going to be this very painful process for both of us, because I got to write up all of this and not offend you and not break any HR practices. And it's not going to be fun for you, because here I'm assessing you and evaluating you. Now, I hope I'm not overblowing it. This is unfortunately the way it is for a lot of people. And I hope everybody wants a different way to approach it. And so I talk a lot in the book about a completely different mindset, which is much more collaborative, that the review is actually a failure. It's a failure of communication and alignment, because the fact that you need to sit down and have this once a year, even once a quarter, explicit discussion of your performance is a failure of framing, and it's a failure of communication. Yeah. You should be continually aligning on a daily and a weekly basis. And you should both know when all that alignment is working and when it's not, and have already been working on the ways to continue to improve that alignment.
So in some ways, a performance review isn't even needed. And Jay has a follow-up point. It really needs to come from the customer and client versus the manager. So external inputs, not just only your direct manager.
You should always want to, I talk in the book about sort of 4 different anchors for the next rules. And you should always want as an individual to be growing. You should always want to be focusing on being effective in your work. You should always want to focus on being aligned with others. And you should always want to be focused on involving others and being as inclusive as possible, and no matter what your role is. And if you are the driver of that, as a worker, and you want to continually push yourself to be able to continue to improve in each of those areas, then again, the performance review is absolutely unnecessary. It's much more you have your own drive. And as long as the organization and your what I call the team guide is sending all the right signals about what the agreements are, of all of those things about how you're going to grow and how you're going to align and so on, then it's an artifact. You can toss it.
Okay, great. Now, you mentioned a team guide. You have a very different approach to talking about leading and managing people. Can you go into a little bit? Because I thought that was one of the most revolutionary things you had in the book. Because not to wordsmith things, but the concept of a leader or a manager needs to fundamentally change in these new rules, in the next rules of work.
So I often say I'm not trying to be the word police. I want to encourage a new mindset. And if I use that word over and over again, it's not just because I think Charlene is one of the great thinkers on that in that approach, but in the book I sort of position it as the three legs of the stool are mindset, skill set, and tool set. And so I start with mindset, and we start with the labels, because once we all sort of use labels that either have lost meaning or are so anchored in an old rules way of thinking, then a whole bunch of negative things come from that. And so the role of the manager is one of them. Now, Peter Drucker was an old friend of my father's, and a fascinating guy. And I give him a tremendous amount of credit for helping to shape this whole arena of management. But I do believe that Mr. Drucker himself would even worry about what we've done to the role of the manager. And I use the example of our friend Esther Wojcicki's book, Moonshots in Education. And she talks a lot about the role of the teacher going from being the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. No longer the person with all the answers, but instead the one with all the best questions. And I urge for the same kind of thinking about that person formerly known as the manager. The team guide is much more about enabling every individual in a team to be able to develop their human potential, to be able to co-create and co-collaborate around dynamically binding around problems, solving the problems together, and going on to the next one. And so that team guide is much more of a support and much more of a person that is enabling and empowering, rather than this sort of top-down, structured, hierarchical, the one responsible for managing the information that comes from above and from below. And instead, somebody that is going to enable continual alignment within the organization, continual growth, and so on.
And that's such a revolutionary, it's such a small kind of logical step, right? Because with work becoming so much more complex, how can you actually have all the answers? So I love this idea of being a guide and helping each person reach their full potential. When you share this with people go, okay, so that sounds good. That blows up my entire conception of how I need to lead.
Right.
So what are some of the first steps? Because there are a lot of leaders listening here. What are some of the things they have to now do differently or think differently? As you say, this is a mindset.
So I'll offer two different contexts. One is the more tactical, when you've got a team, you're in an organization, and your major focus is trying to enable that team to basically meet the needs of the organization stakeholders. And then for somebody who may lead in an organization and have more than one team that they work with. And so we'll start first with at the team level. So I do a thought exercise in the book that I'll describe very, very briefly. But the basic premise is, you as a team guide, you come in on Monday and you say, I'm not sticking around. And for the rest of the week, day by day, you say, I want each of you to define the problems that you solve in a given week. I want you to define the skills that you bring to solve those problems. I want you to define the tasks that you do. And you're doing this all with Post-it notes on a whiteboard in a design thinking exercise. And then I want you to recalibrate all that. The skills that each of you have, the tasks you perform, and the problems you're trying to solve. Focus on the problems, reorganize all of that so that it's done the most effectively between each of you. And I, as the team guide, I'm going to do none of that. And then on Friday, I'm going to come back in and say, okay, make all that happen. Now, what you did was a couple things. Is first off, you brought a new mindset, which is you didn't solve any of the problems, like not a single one of them. You just set the framework within which they could potentially effectively solve those problems. And then you showed them how each of their skills are complementary. And if there are skills that are missing, you're going to be putting red Post-it notes up on the wall and saying, these are the skills we need to either hire for, or we've each got to develop for, to be able to solve these problems for the organization stakeholders. And then there's a whole bunch of things you need to do around aligning all of that activity so that it meets the needs of the organization's strategic goals. And so that's just one example, but that is a set of practical steps that any team guide can go through, where they're sending all the signals to the team is, you guys solve this. Like, I'm here to, when you encounter big roadblocks, especially if those are roadblocks with the bureaucracy of our company, I'm here to help you. But otherwise, you're not on your own. I'm always there to support you, but I'm there to guide.
So the role of the guide there is to create that space, create that container, hold that space for people, define it for them,
Yeah.
and then remove any roadblocks that may be standing in the way, getting more resources in, but not to do the work, not to lead the work. The team actually decides what to do.
And also to do these continual recalibrations to help people, because we tend to bungee cord back. I mean, this is one of the things with all this back to work stuff that people are talking about ad nauseum nowadays. We tend to bungee cord back, and what people can fall back into is not having a learning mindset. I've got some of your viewers may know I've got like 9 courses on LinkedIn Learning with about 850,000 learners, and learning mindset and learning agility are the 2 most popular courses. And so you can lose that mindset that you're continually learning. Well, that's the team guide's job, is to help you to always have a learning plan. Think of yourself as a lifelong learner. So those are the places actually where the majority of energy of the team guide needs to focus, and not on this mechanical day-to-day, like, are you doing, I call it management by surveillance. The old rules were just, did you do the things you promised me you would do? And if you missed one of them, then I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. It's like, that's a waste for everybody.
Yeah. So what is the role of the leader then, as opposed to a manager or a team guide?
So I know I'm being the word police, but I try not to use the word leader much. I say people who lead in an organization, because I believe anybody can lead. And now there are people who have more responsibility than others. There are people who are more visible than others. There are people who are paid much better than others. Although that's another thing we could talk about. But basically, there are people that have more responsibility and therefore are seen as being guides of many teams. And so I don't use the word leader, because I think that to some extent we've lost a little bit of the meaning of it. There's this, what I call the leadership industrial complex, that started back with In Search of Excellence. I knew Bob Waterman and Tom Peters, and it started this sort of approach where we get pundits who are continually talking about how to be the best leaders. And I think we tend to lose a lot of that. Anybody can lead in an organization. Anybody can be that guide, can be the one pointing to ways to solve problems. And in fact, with a disruption mindset, anybody should be. You should be able to continually see new ways to meet needs of stakeholders. But instead, I say there's a different skill set that is needed to be this much more guiding hand of the organization when you've got greater and greater responsibilities. And I think this is one of the unique times in history to be able to demonstrate that. What you see with a lot of traditional organizations, especially you'll see in, for instance, financial services, to some extent in manufacturing, but those who lead in those organizations, some of them are pushing very, very hard to get back to the office and get back into the hierarchical structure where they can do management by surveillance, what used to be called management by walking around, which comes from In Search of Excellence. And so instead, I say, look, this is an opportunity for you, as those who lead in large organizations, to send new signals to people that you want them to continually co-create the way that the organization is going to meet the needs of its stakeholders. And simply trying to shove people back into, to shoehorn them into the old office structure is actually going to lose you a bunch of workers. You're going to find that unless you are sending all the signals about flexibility, about co-creation, collaboration, to be able to continually build these adaptive processes and practices, as we all figure this out together, we could be doing this still in a year in many places, then this is your chance. This is your chance to actually illustrate more guide-like behavior.
Yeah. And I remember I cut you off in talking about how leadership would change. Again, if you have a greater span of control, you're running multiple teams. Is there any significant way that leadership has to change?
So one of the things I push a lot on is alignment. So if you think about, again, in a perfect world, you've got very explicit strategic goals for the organization. You could stop anybody in a hallway and they would be able to recite for you the top 3 strategic goals of the organization, the top 3 strategic goals of their team, and their own top 3 strategic goals. and how all of those are aligned. If every single person in the organization could do that, then I would say your job as someone who leads in an organization isn't done, but you're doing all the things that you need to, because the alignment between everybody, what ends up happening is, especially in a world of distributed work, is you have all these flywheel effects that pull us apart. We stop being able to communicate as much directly. We stop being clear about the needs of the organization stakeholders. And again, this is an opportunity as someone who leads an organization, especially in large organizations, to be pushing for the processes that will keep you in continuous alignment throughout the organization.
And that's interesting because so many of the reasons why larger organizations are so dysfunctional is because of these lack of congruent processes or communications or alignment.
Yeah.
You're like, why are you doing that? It's the opposite of what I'm doing here. It just doesn't make any sense. So that's a really interesting thing, that is your core job, is just to create that alignment.
Well, and especially in a world where, Gallup does its famous study of engagement every year. And in a world where many who lead in organizations are tearing their hair out, I did that a long time ago, to try to figure out, well, why is that? Like, why aren't they engaged in their work? Or why is it that I have such a hard time getting millennials to be thinking about working for my organization when they keep pounding the table about purpose? Or as far as I'm concerned, these all have the same roots, which is you want to empower workers to understand the strategic goals of the organization, and you want to empower them to work together to figure out how to meet those needs. And if they feel, instead of being in a very hierarchical structure with very sort of rote job descriptions and repetitive tasks, those are the things that eventually, we're going to automate a whole bunch of that stuff anyway. So you want to keep on helping people move to the sort of upper right part of the quadrant, which is problems that require creative problem solving, that require you to use a wide range of your skills, that require you to dynamically bind around new problems, so you're constantly solving the next challenges for the organization stakeholders. Those are all things that drive engagement. And the more you can empower people throughout the organization to actually be the ones who should be solving those problems, you're going to see your engagement numbers shoot up.
Well, there are quite a few comments in here and questions too. People are really enjoying this conversation, and I definitely am too. We have a question from Jay Johnson. How do you see the evolving role of guilds and labor unions in this new world?
Yeah. So, Jay, that's an excellent question. So in the final chapter, which is called a conclusion, but as far as I'm concerned, is actually setting the table for the next set of things to solve. The subtitle of the chapter is "The World We All Want." Now, what do I think the world we all want is? I focus a lot on macroeconomics and just what we often call a workforce in different countries and that sort of thing. It's sort of what those design heuristics are, because it turns out no matter what country you're in, an awful lot of your lived experience with work ends up being what a lot of those rules are. I break it down to individuals, organizations, communities, and countries. And at the country level, there's a whole bunch of things that different countries have done to try to essentially determine how you balance the table as much as possible. And it's a zero-sum game to think of it as just the organization and the workers. And but basically you could think of it as it's power dynamic. And so what ends up happening in a country like the United States, which has a rapidly descending level of labor participation, collective voice, collective action, compared to, say, a country like Germany, in the 3 weeks that the pandemic finally took hold in early 2000, we went from about, depending on where you were, about 3 to 5% unemployment in the United States to 17% unemployment in 3 weeks. Germany went from about 5.4 to 5.7% unemployment. And it's because there's a bunch of rules that are baked into their economy that are agreements between those who lead organizations and those who work in organizations. And you can argue that that's a lot of frictions that make it very challenging to fire workers. And, so there's frictions in the system that can create challenges, but those frictions are exactly what kept people employed during a pandemic. And so the answer is we need to innovate as rapidly as possible in ways to be able to balance the table. Now, I'm the last one to defend traditional labor unions, which have a whole bunch of potential challenges. They created their own power dynamics, their own hierarchies, their own independent and unfortunately less accountable systems in many cases. But there are some really hopeful signs of the kinds of collective voice and collective action that you can see are happening all around the world and even here in the United States that are very hopeful signs where we can use these disruptive technologies actually to help us to be able to build much more closely knit agreements about the ways that workers, from gig workers to people in traditional organizations, can have more collective voice and collective action.
Gary, this is so good. We just have a few minutes left. I just want to, again, put up a plug for your book. If you're enjoying this conversation, I think many of you are, get this book. It is absolutely fantastic. There is so much wisdom just in that book. Again, I just love this one page with all the next rules. And there's literally a reference guide. Just go back and forth between each of things. I literally keep it on my desk because it's so helpful. I want to talk very briefly about one of the last points that you make, which is we need to rethink and change the rules of what is the purpose of an organization. Because the first time you told me this, I was floored. So can you just share your concept here?
All right. So just very briefly, look, again, we've got these rules that we've inherited from previous iterations. The organization, if you really want to distill it down to what an organization does, is you can think of it as a framework or a platform where we channel human energy to be able to create value for an organization's stakeholders. And the stakeholders are a set of decisions that people who start organizations, run organizations have made. And it's a set of bargains and agreements, right? So you can think of, unfortunately, driven by thinkers like Milton Friedman, in the United States, we have doubled down on this conception that the only stakeholder that really matters for an organization is its shareholders. And there's unfortunately a whole bunch of really systemic challenges that can come from that if we only let that take over and drive the rationale and decision making for an organization's purpose. We get short-term thinking, we get quarterly reporting, we get a whole bunch of negative externalities that we can claim are problems that are not our problems, from pollution to poor worker pay. And we do all those things because we're just trying to meet the needs of a shareholder. And so I talk a lot about how we can hack capitalism for good. We can actually rethink it. Rethink the purpose of an organization. And that's actually, again, co-creation, but within organization stakeholders. There's a number of organizations that are very, very successful. Let's say if your employees are your workers are your number one priority, then you're going to make everybody happy. Your customers, your shareholders, and so on. Your communities, the communities in which you work. You can't ignore the needs of those communities. If you perpetually open a new factory and have a whole bunch of workers employed in a rural area, and then you shut down that factory without taking any of the repercussions for it, then you're going to have all these negative impacts on society. And so I encourage people instead to have just a completely different mindset, much more inclusive mindset, which is that you're continually co-creating this process of understanding what the organization's stakeholders are, their key stakeholders, what the needs are, what the strategic goals of the organization and meeting those needs are, and then building that as your structure for alignment throughout the organization. We started something 20 years ago. We co-founded with a number of amazing people, something called SOCAP, Social Capital Markets. And the whole premise was doing well and doing good. So we had a group called Capital Capitalists. We started 20 years ago, and then SOCAP was started 2008. And the premise was that you could actually, at the intersection of money and meaning, you can build businesses that have tremendous purpose and are tremendously successful. And they're not trade-offs. It's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, I think the Business Roundtable recently came out about 2 years ago now. I remember seeing the article, and they said it's not just about shareholders, all these other things. And I just want to just read the last rule here. The purpose of the organization is a platform for channeling human energy. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that just gives me chills.
So I talk about I talk a lot about skills, human skills, because there's a lot of focus on that, and I think we kind of misunderstand what skills are. There's great research going back literally to the 1950s in the United States that breaks skills into 3 different categories: what I call no skills, flex skills, usable in a range of situations, and then self skills on ourselves. But if you think about what a skill really is, it's we channel our human energies to perform a task or to solve a problem or to interact with other people. And so you've got so much energy you can expend throughout your time here on the planet. And you've got a lot of choices about how you expend that energy. And you can expend that energy on just making money or just acquiring things, but there's a whole bunch of other things you could be expending that energy on. Now, when we as humans, when more than one human gets together and wants to expend their energy on something, sometimes we call that sports. Or sometimes we call that a conversation. But when we do it to try to build economic value, we call that an organization. And so by rethinking that, by having a different framing, we are getting together as humans and we're agreeing how we're going to channel those energies, and we're going to create value for somebody. We want to create value for each of us as individuals. We want to create value for a customer because we know that's sustainable. If you're a nonprofit, you're going to create value for a community or for a population or for the planet. And all of that process of continually channeling human energy should just be more explicit. Like, let's just agree that's what we're doing. There's only so much energy each of us have. There's only so many hours left on the planet. Let's all do it in ways we think are going to actually get the kinds of value in the world that we believe need to happen.
Well, I'm going to start closing up here because I think that is such a great way to leave out. You started by talking about how we need to be much more human-centered, and you end up here about channeling that human energy. And you paint such a great picture of what work could be and how we as leaders and guides, to use your language, need to be moving our organization towards that. So thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today. Again, Gary's new book is The Next Rules of Work. And you can learn more about Gary at his website, gbolles.com. And just a last little thing, next week I'm going to be talking about it's time to heal failure. How do we deal with failure? And again, join me at our regular time at 9 o'clock Pacific time, 12 o'clock Eastern. Gary, there are so many comments. I hope you go back into the stream and just look at them. So many people are like, this is awesome. This is wonderful. Making recommendations of people you should connect with, the unions. So thank you so much. It's been such a great conversation. And again, congratulations. All the congratulations on a wonderful book.
Thank you for all your help and support. You've been marvelous. You're doing a great friend and mentor. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gary. And thank you everyone for joining. And we will see you next week. Take care.